Hello and welcome to Open Minds UFO Radio. This is your host, Alejandro Rojas, and I am here with my good buddy, Martin Busy Dude Willis.
Yeah, a little
busy.
Keep
busy out there, huh? But that's a good thing.
Yep. Oh, I got to keep this brain busy. Boy, I'll tell you.
Yeah, if you don't keep your brain busy, it goes to mush.
Or dark places.
Ooh, oh, yeah, that's even worse. And there's a lot of dark places to go. So let's keep you busy. We'll keep your brain busy. So speaking of which, I want to start mentioning this at the beginning of the show because I don't mind, but I want people to know, at the beginning, the first segment of the show here with me and Martin for the first about 24 minutes, go over UFO news. So we're going to have the latest UFO news in just a minute here. And then the actual interview starts at about 24 minutes. So sometimes people like to skip ahead. So I want to let people know that. But let's get into the news first, but I do want to introduce who my guest is going to be, and that is Mike Demonte. Cool name, I think, but he is the guy who runs Punk Rock and UFOs, a cool blog. He's also written a couple books. Those books are Punk Rock and UFOs, Cryptozoology Meets Anarchy, and then Punk Rock and UFOs, True Believers. So Mike is a journalist by trade. That's what his degree is in. He's written for the Houston Chronicle quite a bit. He was a staff writer for them. He's still writing for them regarding music. So that's one of his big beats is music. He also has written for sports and other topics, but music is kind of a big one. That's the punk rock, thing in his title. But it's really helpful to talk to someone, who's a journalist and kind of his viewpoint as to, being someone who's trained in mainstream journalism. What does he think of what's going on right now? In fact, I've read some of his blogs, and that's why I'm having him on, is that I think he's got some really interesting perspectives and things to say. Also, we talk about why punk rock and UFOs. What does punk rock have to do with UFOs? Some of us might kind of intuitively think, oh, I get what the thing is. But we'll talk to Mike about that, and I think it's an interesting perspective he has on that as well. He does share that in his first book, which is about cryptozoology, because he likes other paranormal kind of topics. And then his second book, True Believers, is actually more focused on UFOs and kind of the UFO community and what the UFO community feels. Now, he has had his own sighting, and that's what has inspired him, so he's definitely really into the topic and feels there's something to it. So great interview. I had a lot of fun talking to him, and we'll have that interview coming up after the news. But first, UFO news, Mr. Martin.
Well, today there's a lot of great stuff, and actually if you go into the UFO headlines over at Open Minds TV, you'll see some links to some great stories. And this one here, this is a blog by Cheryl Costa. I know she's been on your show a number of times. And she writes for the Syracuse New Times. She does a blog there. And, it's been several years now on this topic of UFOs. And this particular blog I find very interesting because it's something that I talk about quite a bit, actually, and get asked about. And the title is Timing is Everything for UFO Observations. Well, she writes this like she's actually telling the story here, so I will go in some quotes here. As a UFO researcher and journalist, folks frequently ask me about when people observe UFOs. I usually smile and reply, that's not an easy answer. And she continues, after Linda Miller Costa and I built the UFO sightings database, which we used to create our 2017 book. The title of that book is UFO Sighting Desk Reference. We began to the process of analyzing the raw data on a relatively superficial level. In 2017, we could tell you that the UFO sighting reports were generally driven by three principal factors. I find this interesting: population, temperate weather, and leisure time, which is something I never thought of, but that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense.
Yeah. Since 2018, we have had the opportunity to dig deeper into the data, which now totals 146,800 sighting reports. By utilizing some creative algorithms, we've been able to refine our understanding of the UFO sighting phenomena, and there are more factors: population, regional, seasonal weather, daily seasonal activity, and time of day. This part here I find very interesting because she continues on here. Whenever I publish a listing of the top states for UFO sightings, I get a flood of social media responses that inform me the reason California is number one is because of its population. In-depth examination of the data reveals that California is a unique situation. California crosses 9 lines of latitude, which makes the state a complex model. As an experiment, I constructed a pseudo-California using the East Coast states, which by the same lines of latitude and similar landmass, California's population in 2018 was 39.56 million. By comparison, the pseudo-California represented on the East Coast was 52 million people. And guess what? The East Coast model has far less UFO sighting reports. I really think a lot of that's weather myself, but she does talk about that regional and seasonal weather. She goes into that, and not to take too much about this, to take up too much time about this, but the daily seasonal activities. There are more sightings during when people are busy outdoors, doors doing things, baseball games, you name it, things like that. Time of day in the United States, 72.6% of the UFO sighting reports generally occurs in the hours between 4 p.m. and midnight, and with a peak between 9 and 10 p.m. In essence, bedtime or the last smoke outside, walking the dog. You hear about that, smokers and dog walkers. The hours between midnight and 4 p.m. represent 27% of the typical day's UFO sightings. And we've noticed that after about 5 a.m., the daily UFO sightings volume is relatively flat, about 12.5% of peak hours. Isn't that something? This is all really interesting to me. So, when people see UFOs in Alaska, the peak months are in the dark winter months and in the months with measures of light in the dark days. But in May, June, and July, UFO sighting reports are at rock bottom. So the summer months are mostly all daylight all the time, or white nights as they sometimes call. Interesting stuff, isn't it? Are you there, Alejandro?
Yes, I think it is really interesting stuff. I think it's just really hard to cut up the data, in a useful way. So, for instance, mirroring the West Coast with the East Coast states, I don't know that that's really accurate. And I think what she's getting at with this different geographic lines, because I did look at that story, is they're different climates. It changes. So, I think it would be more accurate to look at specific climates, to segregate them and then look at those as opposed to kind of glomming big areas, because I think she has something. I looked at one of the latest, or at least one of the reports I have up where I agree with those people who say population is a big deal. And when I just did it per population, per state, California dropped to 15. Now, of course, a state border is a pretty random line itself. It's just kind of just chosen out of nowhere, as political reasons and stuff. So it's just kind of segregations of populations and stuff. So, so 15 is still pretty high for California per as far as sightings per person. But then again, that's just the number of reports. That's not good reports necessarily. And like you said, I think weather, because it's nicer out in the western states, which are higher, at least when I've put these together typically. Although Maine is pretty high too.
Yeah, Maine. I forget where Maine is on the list.
When I did per population, and let's see, this one's 2014, Maine was number 9.
Okay. Wow, yeah, that is pretty high. And we're very, very low population, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's something like 300,000, or I don't even know for sure. But it's pretty low.
2014 is 1.3 million.
That's close to 300,000. Which
is still pretty low. I mean, in that, many cities have more than that. So. And in relation, California has, it probably has over about 39 million people. So
I should say it feels like there's about 300,000 people here. Yeah. A lot of open land.
Yeah. Which is nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So an interesting story. I think it's a great service she does to tackle these numbers and to look at them, and then to also offer up some ideas about them. In her article. So yeah, that was a good one. Let's see, what else did we have out there in headlines? We had
before we move on, let me just I'd like to add just one last thing.
Yeah.
And because I'm sure people have asked you, like when is a good time and all that. And it is so random. I mean, that's the one thing. That's the one reason science stays away from UFO researching, is because of the random ways really they show up. You can't reproduce it.
Well, and like she said, there's less sightings during the daylight hours and more at night. The problem with the night things, of course, sightings, is that just things that are normal can look abnormal at night. When you see lights, you don't know what the light configuration is. Very likely those lights are on an aircraft, and if it was daylight, you would be able to recognize that very quickly, or a drone, or what have you. Yeah. So you could tell people to look at night. The other problem with night is it's hard to identify things, and it's even harder to photograph things. It may be best to tell people during the day. I just tell people they're seen everywhere. Does seem to go better, better to go to hot spots, but putting in the time, just looking up a lot.
Yeah. I mean, most people looking down at their smartphones.
Yeah.
Not looking up. Yeah. And going on with their daily lives. So, yeah. Yeah.
So a couple other stories out there. There's an opinion piece out there in the Buffalo News. It's Don Paul. He writes what he believes about aliens, and he goes over, I think this is good. I know a lot of people interested in this stuff will be frustrated because he takes a skeptical look, but of course that's why I appreciate it. But essentially he's saying that, there are a lot of sightings, so we can't just blow them all off, but that doesn't mean that they're all alien. And so he goes over, a lot of some of the science and thoughts about if they're out there, or how could they be out there? How would they get here? All of kind of the science around some of this stuff. And I think it's really interesting. Don Paul, the guy who wrote the article, was a broadcast meteorologist for 34 years on Buffalo TV. You may say, well, what does that, how does that, qualify him to speak on the science of this? But meteorologists, do a lot of science around. I mean, first of all, they use the Doppler, so they understand, that sort of radar and everything. And then they also do, they learn a lot of science around climate and weather and how it works. And so they also learn over the years, about the types of things that can't see, kind of cosmological phenomena as well. So in that respect, I mean, meteorologists are scientists, and so, yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. And I think what's great is just that he's talking about it.
Right. We're seeing a bit of that now, it seems.
There was also a big meteor in Georgia.
Oh, yeah. That was
in
something.
the Tallahassee Democrat. Did you see that one?
I did. Yeah, I mean, it really lit up the sky.
Mm-hmm.
That was something else. Yeah, that made the news right away.
This is a fun
I saw
one.
that on my phone. Yeah.
Too. The Russians did a flyby of Area 51, and this was written by Tyler Rogaway. Have you had him on your podcast yet?
Luckily, I have. Yes, he's great.
I thought so. Yeah, he's great. So he wrote a story. This is an interesting one, that the Russians just did a flyby of Area 51. Dun, dun, dun. What are those Russians up to? But this is not like some secret thing where they just secretly, flew over and we caught them or something. This is a regularly scheduled program where there are agreements where they can fly over some of our stuff and we fly over some of their stuff, and we're aware of it. So, I mean, this is when, hide anything you don't want to see. But this is they flew one of their Tu-154M aircraft. They get real specific on this website. And took pictures of Area 51, and they've got some pictures of Area 51 and some more information about Area 51 on this article about this situation.
That really is something. And the open, what is it called? The Open Skies Treaty, basically. It was signed back in 1992. And I think it's kind of almost bizarre that this treaty exists, but that you can actually fly over and take pictures. I mean, it seems like we're always trying to hide things, and everyone's trying to hide things. But in a way, I guess it's a good thing. Kind of if it's an even playing field for everyone, I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm sure we're still trying to look at each other and observe and do, reconnaissance off of these times. But I guess it is at least some openness as far as, and, I don't even know the whole history about it. Maybe it's to make sure that, they can see what we're doing with our, nuclear facilities and stuff like that. So we're all on the same page and we have some openness. But it is, I felt like you. I felt kind of like, hey, it's nice to have, this cooperative sort of program in the news, as opposed to, of course, so much fighting and stress and
and
it's a
what's
real
really
stressful time when it comes to the U.S. and American relations.
What I think is really interesting about this is it also states that a copy of all data collected will be supplied to the host country. So they actually give the host country what they've surveilled.
Yep. So if you're trying to sneak onto Area 51, the Russians might see you and say, hey, you got some goofballs over here trying to sneak in Area 51.
What if they see a saucer?
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah.
Hey, we saw you got one of those aliens busted out of, one of your containment areas at Area 51. We got a picture here of him crawling around, so you might want to.
Yeah, it looks like a guy with glasses. Bob Lazar, maybe?
Yeah.
Wow. Spotting him down there. Yeah.
So, so that's a good one. Billy Cox. So this is what's funny about Billy Cox. You know who Billy Cox is, right?
Yeah, he's in Florida.
Yeah, Sarasota Herald Tribune is something, it was what he writes for. Again, he's another, I guess he's not full-time there, so he kind of has to make a living on the side. He used to be a little bit more prolific with writing these stories, but he has a blog over there called The Void, and he writes about UFOs. And it's funny because he's so well known, at least amongst many of us in the UFO field, that I kind of took it for granted and thought, he's got to be so popular and everything. But it is kind of a little unknown thing. And I could see why. I always make fun of his titles because they don't have UFO in them, and you wouldn't know what the hell he's writing about.
That's right. I noticed that.
And he doesn't get on social media a lot. You can't subscribe to an email so you're notified when his stories come up, because his stories are great. So you got to go search for him, at least, check back on his blog once in a while. But it's well worth it. And this is a big plug for watching his site. Fortunately, I got to meet him for the first time in Alabama.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, so he was at the SCUs.
Yep, he was. And he doesn't look like I thought he would look like for some reason. I've even seen some pictures, which are hard to find, but that was kind of funny. But it was great to meet him, and he was there, and he just posted yesterday an article kind of overviewing his thoughts on the SCU presentation on the Nimitz case and some more, a little bit more about, the SCU event. He's got another article about the SCU event that he wrote, a week ago, but this one is newer. And going over the Nimitz encounter, which was a great presentation that was done at the SCU conference. And of course, you've had Robert Powell on most recently. And I think you're one of the few to have Robert Powell recently, because he was waiting till he gets his Nimitz report out to do more interviews. But so your listeners got some of the latest there, but they can see some more. And then that presentation that they did will be shared publicly in the not too distant future as well.
Yeah, I can't wait till that's out. So I don't know. I didn't hear you say that the title to this article is called "Drilling In."
Yeah, exactly.
It's not clickbait, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's not clickbait. And drilling in, you'd be like, what the heck is he talking about? And his titles are like that. So, I didn't get a lot of time to talk to him. I would love to talk to him some more, but I don't think that he really likes to draw attention to the fact that he writes about UFOs.
Yes, I've written him in the past, never got a response to see if he'd come on my show, but I just don't think he's, you can take that in a number of different ways, but maybe he just doesn't want to be, so known for it, but still is interested in writing about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you met him. What do you think?
I think you're right. I think, you know what? I don't know. We didn't get I was hoping to have a lot of, one-on-one time with him, because I have so many questions and just to kind of connect some more. But we never had that chance. Time just flew by. But that is an interesting question. And he is somewhat humble about his stuff. That would be a good question. But some of the examples of his titles are kind of funny. Here's one: A, B, C, D, F, G's.
Is he talking about G-Force?
No, he's talking about all of the acronyms and this, group and this group and all of these different groups, especially lately with these potential UFO groups. Where do they lie with all these acronyms? So pretty funny. Finally, I do want to talk about, and of course we do in the last couple minutes here, I mentioned this probably every April Fool's Day, but it is, I think, the best April Fool's UFO story. But this is Virgin's UFO prank that happened in 1989. This was over London, but it's a really good story where Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin, the owner of Virgin Galactic and Virgin Airlines and all of that, Virgin Records, of course, I think is where it started. He pulled this UFO prank. And so we've got this article that I posted today as well in the headlines that people can check out. But it is a really funny prank that really scared the police and freaked a lot of people out. But it's a pretty interesting.
Balloon.
Yes, it was a balloon. Now you gave away
it's really some great pictures of it too. There's the bottom lights up, and it's a saucer with the dome on the top and light, propulsion lights down below or whatever it is.
Sure enough, this story gets out pretty much every April 1st. Somebody kind of talks about this story. And the History Channel has an article out. Actually, I linked to it. It's called 9 Outrageous Pranks in History. And one of those 9s is this one. And I've seen little bits of it here and there, but they're usually just a little summary of a paragraph or two. So when I put together this article a few years ago, I wanted to do something that was more full, because you never get the full story. And I wanted something with a lot of pictures because you never get, each of these stories, they'll have 2 paragraphs and maybe 1 picture. So I wanted to compile a lot of pictures as well. And Virgin had written this great thing about it a few years ago. So I wrote out a really full piece with lots of great pictures from it.
Do you know how, I didn't read through the article totally, but do you know how long this thing was airborne for and what type of reactions that they had?
Oh yeah, I don't know how long. I do know how long it was airborne, but I can't remember right now. I'd have to review the story. But yeah, people freaked out. There were some people who knew, but a lot of people freaked out, and you'll see why. He did this very early in the morning, and when you look at the pictures, you'll kind of see why people freaked out. I mean, it was a UFO. It was very intentional to look like one, and then the lights, the way it was lit up, was very interesting as well. They did a great job. This thing must have been really expensive.
Yeah.
But we're out of time, buddy.
We are, I see.
Yep.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Martin Willis from Podcast UFO, for joining us with the news.
My pleasure as always.
We are going to take a short break, and then we will be back with Mike Demonte of Punk Rock and UFOs, so stay tuned. I am happy to welcome for the first time to Open Minds UFO Radio, Mike Demonte of Punk Rock and UFOs. Hello, Mike.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me. I was saying earlier, kind of before we went on air, that I'm really honored to be on the show. We share some mutual friends, and Open Minds TV launched the careers of a lot of people that I'm friends with in this field that I kind of gotten to know, and you guys are one of the first websites to really put this stuff out there. So thank you.
Yes, I am so happy to have you on and to talk to you. This is kind of funny, too, because I've been watching your work ever since you started working, because you started working closely, I know, with Jason. And I remember Jason and Maureen, who used to work for Open Minds, for those who don't know, coming, talking about you when they met you. And I've been wanting to connect ever since then and just haven't had the chance. And it's been so busy, but especially right now. It's like, I got to do it because the moment's right. And we'll get into this, but because of some of what you've been writing about lately. But before we get into that, I do want to kind of talk about who you are, what angle you're taking. So I really love that you're a journalist because, it's important, and I understand that perspective in that world a bit. So that's what's exciting as well. But it also makes me understand that, as you've probably ran into, this is kind of a difficult area to dip your toe in as a journalist. Would you agree with that, or have you found that to be true?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of give you some of my background, currently I teach full time. I do my UFO research on the side, like many of us do. I previously worked at the Houston Chronicle here in Houston. I did web producing, copy editing. I did writing. I did reporting. I covered music and features and sports. And I used to remember, I used to kind of push for this stuff, and it was always kind of met with, kind of like this criticism. And I remember Eric Berger, this name kind of was in the news in our field because his story on To the Stars going bankrupt became this huge thing. But I used to work with him. We used to work together. And we got in a little Twitter banter about Bigfoot. So they decided to have us debate Bigfoot on air. We did a Google Hangout on chron.com, which is Houston Chronicle's website. And it was actually very good, but the way they presented it was still very goofy. Like, we had a guy in the background in an ape suit towards the end come out, which is kind of funny, kind of lighthearted, but just in general, that's kind of the way these stories were looked at at one point.
Why is that? Being a person in journalism, there is always this tendency, and I'd love to hear your perspective as to why that happens, to add something goofy. Whether that be a graphic or, as we've all heard a gajillion times, the X-Files music. Why is that?
It's hard to answer. In my first book, I kind of had a whole chapter about media literacy, and my whole thing was, a lot of times, we see these stories on the news, and there's usually, if there's a sighting or reporting, you usually don't see much in terms of a follow-up story. You have the story, and a lot of times, it's given proper attention, but then it dies from there. You don't have the follow-up or, what's next. And even some of the more mainstream cases nowadays, I mean, it's been months since we've heard, after the Pentagon UFO story. That was almost a year ago at this point. So I can answer that question in terms of, why do these stories kind of die in the media? Just because a lot of times there's not a follow-up, because there's a lot of times there's not resources. I mean, obviously you have certain journalists. You have like George Knapp, for example. He obviously has some pull where he works, so he can do these things. But a lot of journalists don't. They kind of have to go where the money is in terms of, what's going to get clicks and what are the big stories of the day. And sometimes, unfortunately, a UFO sighting is not considered a big story of the day. In terms of the playful nature with the graphics and the music, that's just probably somebody, in that department just not taking it seriously, unfortunately. But I do think we're turning a page in that sense, where these stories are being taken more seriously nowadays.
Now, when it comes to your colleagues, I'm sure you've heard some feedback because as at least it's been my experience, and rightfully so. I mean, this is a thing. You've got a degree in journalism. Journalists are supposed to be skeptical. Yes, and so they are. And so it's often, you're met with some of the largest skepticism with fellow journalists.
And absolutely, that's how it should be. I mean, you should question everything. That's one of the first things I learned in college is, as a journalist, you need to question everything. But it comes to the point, especially in our field, where everybody is questioning everything to the point where it's no one's going to believe anything.
Yeah.
It's good to have a skeptical eye, but it's gotten. I mean, I've only been involved in this field for a few years. I mean, I've been studying this stuff for my whole life, but I've only been, I guess, visible and active, I guess, ever since I started writing my books, but I've always been interested in the subject. And I've noticed, these people who study this, they're very jaded. And it's, some of the comments, Facebook and Twitter, it's very snarky, and it's very kind of back and forth. And I mean, it's probably like that in anything, but, this is a community that's supposed to be coming together and, we're all pushing for the same thing. And it's kind of hard to see that at times.
Right. And it's kind of interesting because, for instance, Lou Elizondo, when I talked with him earlier on, he was like, everybody has to work together. That's going to be his goal, to talk to everybody, get everybody to work together. I think he's found that that's a much more difficult task than he thought it might be. But you felt similarly. I remember seeing a lot of your posts that, we all have to work together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in terms, like I said, I don't work full-time in journalism anymore, but I still have a lot of colleagues, and I've done some local press in Texas. And I remember I have a buddy of mine, she's a producer for Fox 26 here. And I was like, hey, get me on, because I was on there, I did their evening show once, but I was like, hey, have me come in the morning, like be in the studio. And they're like, no, they're still kind of like hesitant, regarding that. So there's not necessarily, I would say, pushback, but it's, there's still other things that take precedent over UFOs and things to that nature.
I would like, your perspective on this as well. And I think this is something that a lot of the UFO community, quote unquote, doesn't get completely, is that, as journalists, like for instance, with you and I, or with you, for speaking with skeptics, your biggest, the most convincing to an editor or to a fellow journalist are your sources. Do you have any sources? And typically we don't have credible sources. But with this new, Pentagon program being revealed and with To the Stars and their members, all of a sudden we have a huge ingest of credible sources. And I think everybody else is frustrated. Well, why didn't anybody listen to us when we were saying some of the things that they said? Yeah. And they don't get it, that they're just not, no disrespect, they don't have the background to be considered, a credible source.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the kind of things I wrote about recently on my website on punkrockandufos.com was that a lot of people don't know, journalists, we rely heavily on these official titles and sometimes to a fault. But if somebody works for the government and Pentagon and you quote them, that is an official source. Now, whether they lie or not, that's not on the journalist. That's for the audience to decide. And one of the things, I always try to teach my students, because I teach journalism as well, is that a good story needs to show balance. And you try to have quotes from, different sources from each side of the argument or each side of the story. But a lot of cases in our field, it's hard because a lot of times you only get one source, or, the source is the person who saw UFO, not the person who said, not the, like I said, not the sheriff in town who lied about it.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause a lot of times, those stories are hard to track down. A lot of times I report sightings, people will, call into me email into me or send me photos, and I'll report on their sightings, but I don't have the time, because I teach full time, and resources to go out to that town and try to track down a cop. So a lot of the times you kind of have to go with what we have in terms of resources and time.
Mm-hmm. And then it's also hard when you have finding the other side, especially when it comes to doing your due diligence and finding a skeptic. At least I find that in that, you want to find someone who's skeptical. But if you go to, let's say, a university professor, they're going to just offhandedly dismiss without educating themselves often. And so that's not fair either, which kind of puts you in a difficult situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very fair that's a very fair assumption of it, because it's true. Because a lot of times, if you're going to go to somebody who you automatically know is going to shoot down the story, then it's like, what's the point?
Mm-hmm.
You want to try to get somebody who always provides some insight, and then go from there.
Yeah, and I think you made another really great point that just because we're writing about what an official says does not necessarily mean we are validating what they say. Of course, we're going to do our due diligence to reveal any deception or any issues that we can uncover about these comments. But just the fact that an official is saying something is news. That justifies it. Whether you like that or not, even if you think you can say something better or more wise, you just don't have the title, like you said, that this person has.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's the official source, and that's what they're saying, and you quote them as so. And like I said, people make their judgments from there.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to punk rock and UFOs, you kind of the punk rock part is a bit kind of like your mission statement. It fits into at least your perspective of this field, and I wanted you to explain that.
So this is always a great question when people ask. So the books are called Punk Rock and UFOs, and obviously the website and the brand is the same name. The idea behind it is, punk rock, the way of thinking, not necessarily the music, but the way of thinking. There's obviously this rebellious nature to it. And why do we choose to rebel against some beliefs and accept others? And I definitely saw a parallel between, what people believe in terms of religion and political beliefs, and as opposed to what they believe in with UFOs and other stuff. So it's like you can believe in this one thing and accept it, but this other thing is all of a sudden out of the realm of possibilities. So it's kind of more about our process of belief. And then also too, the punk rock scene really births a lot of underdogs, a lot of those bands and the mentality. And we are underdogs as well as researchers. And, this whole community is kind of underdogs in everything that we're striving for. So one of the things I try to do a lot with the website is, and with my second book, True Believers, is I try to give us a voice too. Who are these people that are researching this? Why should we care? And yeah, what can we all do to better understand these questions?
Mm-hmm. With your second book also, is that something that you feel that you find is this kind of rebellious nature in a lot of the researchers?
I think intrinsically, yeah. Because like I said, we're rebelling against these preconceived notions and these, these dismissive kind of comments. And you said earlier with the graphics on TV playing the X-Files in the background, and all those things are kind of dismissive. And we've been rebelling against that for a really long time. There's some serious people involved in this research and with serious credentials, and this isn't new. There's serious people have been studying this for a really long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you, when in researching your book and doing your interviews, what was some of the information that you felt? I'm assuming that you learned. And what was it that was most impactful to you that you learned?
That's a great question. So one of the important things I learned is, you never stop learning. The more people you talk to, the more perspective you get. And just looking at my first and second book, it's like night and day. Like my first book is very theory based and very kind of opinionated, and it's kind of all over the place. But the second one is just this more concentrated idea of, what do we need to do to kind of get more people involved in this? And hey, these are the people who are trying to get more people involved in this. And one of a big takeaway from me was we all had this commonality where it all started with something that sparked our inner self to want to research this. A lot of people I spoke to had a sighting or they had something. And then next thing you know, years later, they're either doing a podcast, writing a book, a YouTube channel or a radio show. So it's all started with something. And I think there's something to be said there, that, it all starts with a spark.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually to kind of come back to my original question, which I didn't kind of finish that whole path, was what was your spark? So
I was interested as a very young child about UFOs and Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and unexplained. My mom used to get me these books, these Time Life books. Every month there'd be a new, it was like these hardcover books. They had these really nice photos inside them. And I was just drawn to them at an early age because, I was a comic book guy. I was a horror movie guy. So to me, this was right up my alley. But at the same time, though, there was like a mystery to it. And there was a truth in there. There was something in there that was, to me, that was nonfiction. So I was always interested in that. And I never really stopped being interested in that. But then I had my first sighting. I remember driving home when I used to work downtown. I used to work at the Chronicle. I was driving home and I saw the traditional light orb. And then next thing you know, a couple years later, I'm writing about this stuff. So that was my first sighting that I recall.
So that sighting, when did you say that was?
I would say, I can't remember the exact year, but it was in the 2000s. So it was probably within the past, was it 2019? In the past 19 years, yeah. I'm older. I'm in my mid-30s, so that was probably in my 20s.
It's funny you call that older, but in the punk rock world.
Yeah. I feel older from when it happened, but yeah.
So, and then, so that kind of experience compelled you.
Yeah, it's weird. It wasn't something like instantly. I was like, oh, I got to write a book. Mm-hmm. Something that kind of just sat and, festered. And then I would probably say maybe a year or two later is when or maybe a year later, I don't recall the timeline, but I just remember when I wrote my first book, it was just, I would get up every day. Actually, no, at the time I transitioned into education. So I was a teacher. So I had summers off. So I believe that was my first summer off. So I'd have this routine where I'd get up every morning, write, go to the gym, come home, research, write some more, research, go to bed. And I did that for like basically 3 weeks straight. And next thing you know, I had a book done. So I was very involved in it from as soon as I started writing about it, it just kind of took over.
Mm-hmm. And then you started your blog just a couple years ago, I think, right?
Yeah, it was right. I'm trying to think when it was. Probably it's 2 years old at this point, just because I felt like I needed a continuation. I wasn't sure if another book was going to happen and when. And I wanted to continue to write and research about it. And the website is basically, it says on the thing cryptozoology and culture, and it's obviously the more traditional news stories. There's commentary, there's reviews on there as well. So I wanted to be a little mix of everything. I always like to kind of interview, the fellow researchers, people who are involved in this as well, so people get to know them and what makes them tick, what makes them, what makes them research. And the way, even though it is a blog format and the name is punkrockandufos.com, I definitely approach them like I'm writing a serious news article for print, just because I have that background.
Mm-hmm. Which I very much appreciate, and I'm sure others do as well. But I guess, what is your niche? What do you see kind of a space for yourself in this arena? And I guess this arena meaning journalism and in UFOs. And what is that space?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure if I really technically thought about that, but like for me, the journalism I do now is, I'm not attached to anyone. I'm basically, I have my own website. I don't have an editor to answer to. I don't have an organization to answer to. I do a music blog on the side for the Chronicle still, but that's just like for fun. But I don't have all those mechanisms controlling what I want to do. So I'm able to still continue this research and do it the way I want to do it. In terms of, this UFO community, I think I'm just one of many newer people just getting involved. And I'm always very honored and humbled when, people like yourself and other people ask me to be on their shows and say nice things about me, because it's, that's the biggest takeaway. I wrote a book, and I haven't made any money off those books, but I've had so many opportunities and doors open. And to me, that means more than, making $300 in royalties,
Mm-hmm. And what do you think you've learned, especially, I guess, related to especially the community? I mean, it can be kind of strange getting to know and figuring out the space. And I've especially kind of, done this through Alessandro's experience in the last year. What was yours like?
It was great because it was very welcoming from the start. It doesn't seem as competitive and cutthroat. I mean, obviously there's people, who are jaded, and mm-hmm. I get that. But Jason McKellen was the first person to reach out to me. He was, Rogue Planet. He was the first one to put me on a show, and automatically, I mean, we had so much in common. And I felt like this isn't just a colleague. This is like, even though I've never met him, I mean, we talked on the phone, but like, this is a friend now. So, and then I was talking to Ryan Sprague and Eric Lukes and some other people. And, it's very tight knit, and it's really cool how people are supportive of each other. And, obviously, there's another side to that too, where there's people who've been doing this for a long time. They're jaded. They've been disappointed. They've seen things not go certain ways. And I get that, but it's how you choose to respond to it. And
yes.
a lot of times it's, it's not even worth engaging, some of the people who have arguments, like one of the researchers, I'm not going to name who it is, but I blocked them on Twitter, and I referenced them in my last article because we got into this whole debate because this person believed that To the Stars was a mechanism to sell alien t-shirts,
mm-hmm.
which is probably the the worst take I've heard on that yet.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into some of that because I agree that gets pretty silly out there. But then I guess when it comes to the phenomena itself, at least to me, and especially as a journalist, for you, to me it seems like, even though other journalists can't find stories, and I kind of understand that because you got to really kind of get in there, especially with all the signal to noise, so much noise. There are a lot of really compelling stories to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And not every story has to be necessarily huge or groundbreaking. Like, I love sharing people's stories. I had, so at work, we had a professional development day, and I did a class on UFOs and cryptozoology, and I had a teacher come up to me afterwards saying she's had experiences her whole life, and she was always ashamed to tell people. And she let me tell her story on my website, and that was really cool. Because, like I said, this isn't anything that's going to make front page news, but it's still someone's experience that they're sharing. And, once again, it's up to the audience to decide whether they buy it or not. And there's other stories like I picked up the story that MUFON passed on multiple times. Is this older man who claimed to have a military experiment on him where he was fed supposedly a serum from an alien spaceship. And everything about the story just sounds like something out of a comic book or science fiction. Like, it sounds crazy. But, he was very eager and helpful to provide proof that he was in the military and his paperwork and his blood work. And he had really nothing to gain from this. I was like, you know what? I'll go for it, even though it kind of sounds out there. But, I did 3 different stories on him. And he was just a sweet old man who wanted his story told. So a lot of times it's giving these people a voice or an outlet for them to tell their story.
Mm-hmm. And, and I know that story. In fact, I was familiar with it. And, of course, I did see what you had written about it. And those are kind of hard. How do you take those where someone seemingly, genuine has an extraordinary story to tell? That's kind of a tough one to tackle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't take every story that people just kind of throw at me. There was this person on Twitter who was just sending me stuff all the time, and I just had to pass because it was so kind of out there, and a lot of it wasn't able to be. So like a lot of times, if someone pitches something to me and it sounds like something I've heard before or something that could be possible, then of course I'm more open-minded to doing that story. In this case, you know, you kind of have to try to use your judgment and see if this person's credible in the sense that they're not trying to dupe you or deceive your audience. So for this one, like I said, I spoke to the guy multiple times, and he just sounded like a nice guy who wanted his story told. And he wasn't necessarily like a ufologist. Like, he didn't know a lot of the UFO stuff. He just he saw the Roswell Decoded show on CW. He was like, oh yeah, Roswell. And he was just kind of like, I have a story to tell. You know, that just kind of, you know, jogged back his memory. But he didn't know a lot of cases. Like, I told him about, you know, Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, and a few other ones. And a week later, he called me. He's like, hey, I read those books. They were great. I had no idea. So it's,
wow.
You know, it's kind of part of the sharing.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got to take a quick break. We're talking to Mike Demonte of Punk Rock and UFOs.com. And we'll take a short break. For those of you listening on a radio channel, then you're going to hear a commercial break. The rest of you will hear a short musical interlude, and we'll be right back. You're listening to Open Mind UFO Radio. We are back. You're listening to Open Mind UFO Radio. I'm your host, Alejandro Rojas, and we're talking to Mike Demonte of Punk Rock and UFOs.com. And you mentioned one of your recent stories that you had written about this gentleman with this kind of interesting story, claiming to have been part of this military experiment where he drank this alien serum. Now, was he convinced that it was extraterrestrial in nature, and did he say he was told that?
Yeah, he said he was told that, but he signed these NDA agreements, and he's at the point where he doesn't care violating because he's 84 years old. Mm-hmm. So at this point of his life, even though he's very healthy, he's in great shape, he doesn't care anymore in terms of if he gets in trouble. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he shot a video, I think probably two or 3 years ago. He videoed his whole story, and it's only been like kind of living on like a few message boards. That's it. Like no one's really picked it up and ran with it. So that's why I was like, well, if this is out there, but nobody kind of bid on it. So I wanted to be the one to bite on it because I thought it was interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I personally feel it's good you did. I mean, with a lot of these, and people get frustrated because I don't write about it. I just like you know, I just don't have the time. Yeah. It's a great story to get out there, especially if it's someone who sounds, you know, to be of sound mind and have an interesting background. But you just don't have the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing too. You know, a lot of us don't do this, you know, full time for a living. So, you know, it's whenever we have the time to do so. And you know, like I said, I wish I had more time to devote to, you know, doing three or four posts a week. You know.
Mm-hmm. Now, with your stories, do you necessarily make a judgment? So, like, how do you feel about, you know, whether or not this particular person is you know, accurate, that actually happened? He drank an extraterrestrial serum created by the government.
Well, you know, it's hard because you kind of have to trust in that case. Well, not trust, but you kind of have to give them the opportunity and then go from there. He was able to send me some of his documents that I showed to a nurse and somebody in the military, and they were able to collaborate that, yes, these are real documents, and this is his blood work, and yes, this is extraordinary for someone his age. So for me, you know, the fact that I was able to get a hand of those, you know, those documents and go from there was definitely helpful in making that decision to go forward.
Mm-hmm. And you know, it's kind of funny as a journalist because there's a different perspective also in that we don't necessarily have to know. When we put together a story, we're looking at the credibility of like the witness or the interest in the story, but we're not necessarily making judgments. We're looking for information that'll give us something, indicators one way or another. But at least many of us, I don't know about if you go about it differently, but I don't judge it. I put together the story to get it out there, And then people will ask, well, what do you think? And I'll be like, I don't know. And they'll be like, oh, you got to know. You wrote about it. You got to believe in it or have some opinion. And sometimes I don't know,
No, absolutely. Yeah, I hear you. Because sometimes we have to try to keep our personal opinions out of it, too. So, yeah, it's a tough one.
Mm-hmm. So, Blink-182, would you consider them punk rock?
Oh, absolutely. Obviously, 1999 was a year where, you had Blink and previously you had Green Day and all those bands that were making the mainstream were considered sellouts. But we're like so far past that, those days. And obviously I've covered, I've covered their music and their career my whole life. I've been a big fan, and obviously they're more on the pop punk side for sure. But yeah, that's definitely was my gateway drug into punk rock music was Blink at a really young age.
Interesting. So it had to be especially compelling or impactful to you when, after you even started using this name Punk Rock and UFOs, that Tom DeLonge comes out so full on about UFOs and eventually really, and I make this justification, I don't know if you've seen that in the articles, and I think it's true, that we wouldn't have had these Pentagon revelations without him.
Yeah.
That had to be a pretty big deal for you, especially.
Well, he's never really hid his UFO obsession. He's talked about it in interviews before. One of their DVDs, there's like this bonus footage of him going on, like he's drunk. He drank like a bottle of wine. He was just going on. He was showing all the books in his house, and he wrote a song, "Aliens Exist." And anyone who's listened to Angels and Airwaves, there's very good literary references to the mysteries of the universe and kind of secret societies. So all throughout his career, he's kind of been interested in this. And, I'm kicking myself because I've interviewed him. I've met him multiple times, and I never got the opportunity to ask about this because at the time I was asking him about, Blink. And when Angels and Airwaves was here in Houston years ago, I interviewed him backstage, and it was obviously, I got through in some fanboy questions there, but never at the time did I think to ask him about that. I don't know why. I should have, because now he's a really hard guy to get in touch with. Obviously, went to the Stars Academy and things are being controlled a certain way. Kudos to you. You're the first one to get Mr. Elizondo, so that's huge. And I think that's great that they're starting to come out and slowly talk more to outlets and be more transparent, because I think that's what a lot of people wanted for the past year.
Yeah, that's what's been hard, too, because, Jason and Maureen got that great interview for Open Minds with Tom DeLonge a few years ago, and I haven't had the opportunity to. I've got to speak with him off the record about several things in the last few years, well, all related to all of this, but it's all had to be off the record. And so... and it's not because, major secrets or something like that. It's just because... rightfully so, they're being careful about how they're releasing information. And, right now, Lou's the guy who's sharing the information about the group. So I know what you mean. And it's still, I guess, did it really hit you how significant, and I imagine it was, but I just kind of am curious about your reaction, how significant, these stories were, back in 2016 with October, his To the Stars Academy coming out, and then soon after the Pentagon story. I guess, how did you react to the Stars being created?
So optimism, I guess, is the best way to say it, but you also have to be skeptical too. And to this day, I've said multiple times, I'm not really a fan of the business model aspect to it, but I do say this. The Pentagon UFO story was big for a lot of us because it confirms what a lot of us have been saying for years regarding secret programs. So, he's taken risks his whole life and his whole career. So for him to walk away from Blink, which was the band he created and it's one of the largest bands in the world, to do this, he obviously has a lot of people involved that have credibility. So it was kind of exciting, just to kind of see where it goes from there. And everything that they slowly said was going to happen is slowly happening for the most part. It may not be as fast as some people want or as specific, but I always said, hey, worst case scenario, if we get a documentary TV series or a movie, or if we get this, like it's not a complete loss. I think people have these these lofty expectations. Let them do their work, and it may take a while, but if they get people talking, Mr. Elizondo has been all over, some major media outlets. He's been referenced in plenty of articles, and I think he's the guy going forward because he has so much credibility because of his background, and he's going to be a household name sooner rather than later.
So what is shocking, though, especially as someone writing about this all, and who's a student of kind of the history of UFO research, and it was probably shocking to you. It was shocking to me because Tom DeLonge personally had been telling me, here and there that big stuff is coming. And even I was kind of like, yeah, sure, we'll see. But I was not prepared for, and of course was completely shocked, and still am to this day, about everything that is kind of happening at this point.
I think it's, like I said, a lot of it's a pleasant surprise. I was never shocked by him kind of hyping things up because he's been that way his whole career. That's not a bad thing. That's just, like I said, I've interviewed him before about Blink and about Angels and Airwaves, and he knows how to get people excited about projects he's working on. Does he always deliver? I mean, that's up to people to decide, but I always think his heart's in the right place, and he has, he aims high, and that's something I think that's very admirable.
Mm-hmm. I think that's there's another disconnect there too, also. And let's get into that. So first, this is a question kind of leading into this next set of questioning is the pacing. Like you said, people have been disappointed about information not coming out quickly enough. Have you felt that same disappointment? Have you felt, oh man, they're so slow in their release of information?
No, because I understand to the Stars, it was still a very small operation, even though they have a lot of big people working for them. I know in San Diego, obviously to the Stars aspect of it, the entertainment aspect of it, it's still a very, very small business. It's almost family ran at this point. But going forward, I think it's going to obviously have to grow if the Academy is going to take off and so forth. So, and I also know how he works. He doesn't work well with deadlines. Tom likes to work at his own pace. That's why musically Angels and Airwaves is his baby, and he's able to kind of do things as he pleases. And that's why that was a major rift with Blink that he had with the other members of Blink. But no, I mean, I think with something like this, though, intrinsically you have to be patient because there's analysis that needs to be done. With these television networks, there's contracts. Like for anyone who's ever done television or even interviewed with producers, they know that sometimes producers will be gung-ho about a show and then the network will sour on it, or the direction will change or so forth. So these things take time. All these things that they promised, like, I get it. It's going to take time, absolutely, because they're not self-releasing any of this stuff. There's obviously other companies and people involved.
Right. And so it's kind of been a disconnect for me also because I'm like you. I've been like, when people say that, recently I was on a podcast and Steinfeld is his name, but it was sort of the same thing. He's like, people are so frustrated with him, like there's nothing that's come out since the announcement. I'm like, are you kidding? There's a ton that's come out. And I shared that with him and how I felt, at least from my perspective, we've been getting a lot of great information, since they've been releasing it. Although there's also kind of a different expectations with what information's coming out, and I could see that, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So, for instance, and it's partially Tom's problem, and I kind of have written about this as well, he kind of set up this expectation of some really extraordinary, wild kind of revelations that were coming. And that's what a lot of people in the UFO community were expecting. Now, what was announced for me, from my perspective, was just jaw-dropping and amazing and the absolutely most incredible type of information I could hear, which is that these government agencies were existed and that these ex-officials are now coming out and working with Tom DeLonge. So for me, that was great. But for a lot of others, they were wanting to hear about the aliens at Roswell and about Dulce and all of this other stuff. And I think they still expect that's what is coming out.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? But like you said, we have to, keep our expectations to, was going to say, Tom did a little short documentary with this group called Meta. It's like a motorcycle thing, and he referenced to the stars as a aerodynamic. I'm sorry, what's the wrong word?
Aerospace.
I said a brain fart. Yeah, he has an aerospace company, and it's like it's not that yet. It's like pump the brakes, but like that's just him speaking and aiming high. And someone's going to hear that and say, "Oh, he's lying. They're not this. They haven't done this." That's just like I said, him speaking and aiming high. So I think the first year to the stars, we had the Pentagon UFO story and all these official people coming out, which was great and fantastic. But then no one was speaking. They really weren't speaking to the media outside of that. Tom wasn't doing any press outside of a few mainstream outlets, and then it got pretty much shut down after the Joe Rogan interview. And now you see Elizondo. Now he's coming out. He's doing some press, and now you see him showing up to conventions. So maybe there were some things that they couldn't discuss at the time. I don't know, but I think this is good now that they're being more transparent, because I think that was one of the main concerns with them the first year.
Mm-hmm. And they're kind of in a tough spot, and I don't think people see that as well. And I think that in Alabama recently, Lou talked about this, and that he's got to walk a very fine line, because there's certain things he cannot say. He could get in a lot of trouble for, and also he has colleagues where he doesn't want to step on their toes. So he's kind of this de facto spokesperson, even though he doesn't want to be, and he shouldn't be, but he's the one everybody wants to hear from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's doing a great job, and I think going forward, he probably will be the spokesperson in terms of that sense, just because he doesn't have to do this, but he is, and I think a lot of people in the community appreciate that he's going to these conventions. And a lot of them are small. Like the Alabama one, I didn't even hear about it till like a week before. I'm like, oh, this is a thing. But I think that speaks volumes about his dedication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think that's been important, but also your article. So you've written about, some of the detractors, some of the people who are upset, and you mentioned, and I wanted to talk some more about, your article and kind of how you've dispelled some of the what you see in lapse of logic. So, for instance, which makes it, Tom's got a lot of money, and he is not in trouble financially, fortunately for him, and hopefully this project does not put him in any financial jeopardy. But he's not doing this for T-shirts and book sales.
Yeah, because anyone who's written a book knows you don't make money unless your name's like Stephen King.
Yeah, exactly. So, but what are some of the other arguments that you've seen that you think are kind of invalid?
Well, I think obviously it starts with this is a money grab, or this is just another one of these egotistical celebrities trying to throw their hat in the game. This isn't Megan Fox hosting a show that she doesn't need. This isn't William Shatner hosting a show he doesn't need to host. This is somebody who's actively been involved with this stuff, into the stuff for a really long time, who's passionate about it, who's putting his money where his mouth is and wants to do something about it. Like I just said, a lot of these things are common sense things that, why would you leave arguably one of the biggest bands in the world to come up with some company to fraud people? It just doesn't make logical sense. And that it's all going to be fiction, and it's all UFtainment, and it's all this stuff. It's one of the things they said, they have 3 nonfiction book series. I'm sorry, the 3 books in the nonfiction book series. They said this documentary is coming out. Obviously, there's a fictional aspect of it that they're doing too, but they said that from the start. They said that before the Academy even happened, before when anything about UFOs even happened. Tom was doing his fictional series with the poet Anderson and Strange Times. So, this isn't a front, to sell Hollywood projects. That's another thing too. And then. Just in terms of like the patients, these things take time, and I think that's a logical thing. If they have this data like they say they do, and they're analyzing it, you'd want it to go through the proper avenues to say, you wouldn't want that rushed. So let them do their due diligence and just see from there. Be patient. Right.
And like you said earlier, they're a small group. I mean, it really not all of the people that are listed as team members are full-time TTSA. Some of these people, I mean, I don't think people realize. I mean, Chris Mellon, some of these others, these people come from some very, very, substantial backgrounds, hobnobbing with billionaires and everything. They have a lot on their plate.
And you have to imagine that they're taking a substantial pay cut.
Right. And some of them, fortunately, they don't need money either. I mean, for instance, the Mellons, they've got plenty of money. Still there?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, a lot of those people are, like you said, are set already for life in terms of money.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, I can't speak to all their financials, but, Tom doesn't need money. If he wanted to, he could probably fund a lot of this himself. But then again, it's a lot to ask, I think.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple other things that I wanted to ask you about, and it's also kind of to check myself to see if I'm off on this at all. And I like to do that a lot, but especially with you've got a journalist background. One of the big questions out there is whether ATIP had anything to do with UFOs. And, there are arguments that we don't have any documents explicitly saying that, which is true. However, we do have, some people have argued all we have is Lou's word. Well, not necessarily. We also have Harry Reid's word. We also have all of the Bigelow Aerospace people. At least we've heard from Hal Puthoff, Eric Davis. We've heard from others who confirm that as well. And of course, if people knew the background, which many of these people who are making these claims do, Bigelow has been looking into UFOs for a long time and then was contracted to do that. So I don't understand any doubt. And as a journalist, and I think this is another thing that they're not getting, as a journalist, we're looking for credible sources to say this was a UFO program. When we have the guy who ran the program, the Harry Reid, who generated the funds for the program, and scientists who are inside the program all confirming this, we don't need an official document. We got the guys in the program telling us this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know even the documents that have came out, people like to argue, the playing semantics. Was it ATIP? Was it with a W? Was it with a T? All with the different names it was. And we have to understand with anything of the Freedom of Information Act, it's partial disclosure. So things could be redacted. So there could be things in there that we have not seen or they're not disclosing. So the fact that we haven't got an official document that says in big, bold letters, ATIP was a 100% UFO program, I don't think that's the smoking gun. I think as of right now, we have these people's word and we have some documentation that these programs existed, even though it doesn't say the word UFO and it says other things. We know that they were investigating anomalous activity.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so hopefully we'll get some more information out. But, there's been a little bit more information we've gotten even recently. I noticed you retweeted UFO Joe, who was at the recent talk by George Knapp. And George kind of filled in a few of the gaps there and explained how he got a lot of this information from sources he cannot share in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, George Knapp is a journalist, and a lot of times you're not allowed to share your sources, or if you do, you have to get that approved by your editor. I would think some of George Knapp's editors at iTeam Las Vegas know his sources. I would definitely think those are some of the people who know him for sure. Very few people probably know them, but I would argue that if he ever runs any of those stories, that they're going to go through one of those editors first.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. And of course, as we know with journalists, they're going to be skeptical and they're going to be hard on the information. And I'm in fact, they give surprised they give George so much leeway that they do to run so many of these stories. Which is great because we get so much really good information from George Knapp.
Yeah, absolutely. He's been doing this forever, and he has the credibility within his organization and as a journalist, and throughout us. So it's really cool that he's able to be one of those mainstream journalists. Obviously, there's Leslie Keane and Ralph Blumenthal too, who work for a big news outlet. They have the credibility, and they're willing to write these articles, and their outlets are willing to support them for running it.
So What's next for you? So are you working on another book? Is there another kind of angle you're looking at tackling in your blog?
So what's next for me? Eventually, I'd like to write another book. I have some other books, non-UFO related, potentially in the pipeline. As far as my blog goes, punkrockandufos.com, I'm just continuing what I'm doing and just monitoring all these stories and seeing who I could speak to next and who wants to come to me next. And there's possibly some other opportunities in multimedia. I don't want to kind of reveal anything because I don't know anything yet, and I don't want to jump the gun, but I may be able to go, use someone else's resources to go research some things, and maybe it'll be on TV or the internet. I don't know. But yeah, that's what's next. And a lot of this is, like I said, we have to be patient. Many of us don't have the resources to go out ourselves and, go hunt down, politicians and, break into Area 51. So, a lot of it is, we have to wait and see and go from there.
Mm-hmm. Punk Rock and UFOs.com is where everybody can find your books and your blog. Are there any other URLs or maybe social media you want to send people to?
That's it. My social media is at Mike Demonte on Twitter. I tweet obviously about the subject and my other interests as well, if you can get past that. But yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I love the other interests as well. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much. Like I said earlier, this is an honor to be on, and as soon as you asked me, I got really excited. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much to Mike Demonte for being on the show. It was wonderful to have him. A lot of really cool information. Be sure to check out his website, punkrockandufos.com, for more information and also information on how to get his book. You can see some of his blog. You can also even got merchandise up here. Help him out by buying some of his cool shirts and other stuff here. Lots of really cool stuff. But anyways, I really appreciate having Mike around. I've appreciated his blogs and some of what he's been contributing to this conversation. And of course, it's great to have someone else who's a fellow journalist so that we can kind of share our perspective so people can understand, where we're coming from. And speaking of a lot of the cool information coming up, the SCU, the Scientific Coalition for Ufology. So this is an organization I've talked quite a bit about because I've been involved with working with them and getting information out and hopefully getting access to the world of academia and science. And so their website is the place to go for information about the Anomalous Aerial Phenomena Conference. So the conference they put together that went on a couple weeks ago, wonderful conference that Luis Elizondo was at. So explorescu.org. That's the official release of information. Unfortunately, there were some people who shared information a little prematurely. They were recording or audio taping, the talks. And, some people said, well, why couldn't we do that? And the reason is that, as we get in these conversations, and I tell you guys this sometimes, and you guys know this, when you're talking with people one-on-one, then you share stuff that you wouldn't share publicly. That's just obvious, right? And if we want to get in kind of these think tank type of situations where we're kind of talking about things and spitballing, there's going to be information that will be shared that not everybody's wanting to share. So, for instance, information could be taken out of context. Or we talked with Kevin about this last week, Kevin Knuth, one of the scientists who was there, and he talked about how it's important that anything we say or do is handled carefully and correctly, and that's why we're careful about releasing what we're releasing, getting permission before we're doing it. That's the professional and respectful way to do it. There's no way as a journalist that I can go to any event and then just write about things when I was asked not to. I even then, I'm even more careful to make sure, hey, this was a topic, this was a situation that was all clear, right? And especially when you're working with scientists, you also need to make sure you're framing the information right, to make sure you're accurate, because it's so complicated that if you want to share with the public accurate information, then you've got to verify that you're doing it correctly. So there's a number of reasons why that's important, and there's a number of reasons why for the AAPC for that event. Really, explorescu.org is the official outlet and the best outlet for that information. And there's going to be more and more coming to the website there that you'll see. So you'll see there's an AAPC link, and there'll be some more videos and information. One exciting piece of information that's coming really soon is the Nimitz report. So the investigation that SCU members Peter Reale and Robert Powell did into the Nimitz case, and that's really exciting. I got to see a little bit of a preview and a presentation they did at the event, but they did some really great work there, talked to many witnesses, and many more witnesses and have even been heard out there. So it's a lot of fun. So you'll be able to check that out soon as well. Of course, as usual, please do go to the UFO Congress and get on the email list. That has kind of become the de facto Open Minds email list, to be honest, because as Open Minds, I'm the only guy and I'm working from home working on Open Minds at this point. We used to have a staff, as you all know, people like we were mentioning earlier, Jason and Maureen. But no longer. It is just I. And the website is kind of hosted remotely by John Rayo, who owns the company. And there's changes that go on, and it's not like, they have a whole company to run over there. So like email right now, we really just don't have an email list ability to send out to on the Open Mind side. But we do on the UFO Congress side. So we have been sending out UFO Congress emails, and we do include information and stories on Open Minds as well. So if you haven't joined that email list, please go to ufocongress.com and do so. And if you're already on the Open Minds list, you will be fine, because that was a joint list of the Congress and Open Minds. And so keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, other cool stuff at the UFO Congress. There's a lot of new products there for those of you who like UFO and alien kind of paraphernalia and clothes and junk like that. Lots of really fun stuff there. So you can find that at ufocongress.com. Otherwise, I want to thank Martin Willis for the news. Martin Willis of Podcast UFO. The news that we talked about can be found on the front page of openminds.tv, including that fun story from April Fools of 1989, where Richard Branson fooled Virgin Galactic, kind of fooled all these people in London. Great story, so check that out if you haven't before. But again, you can find that all on the front page of openminds.tv. Otherwise, I want to thank Caleb Hanks for the opening and close music, Systematics for the bumper music, and of course, as usual, I want to thank you, the listeners, for being here once again. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, which will just be next week, in case you're wondering. Adios, muchachos.